Hello everybody and welcome to this video. Today we're going to look at the SQL Server connection in PowerApps, and we're going to find out if it's actually delegatable on the in operator. There's quite a bit of discussion going on this topic at the moment, so I thought I'll quickly make this video to give you some options around this. So if we look at the documentation, we'll see that the in operator is supported, but it's got a footnote number 2. And if we go to number 2, it says that it is supported for string value in column, but not for column in string value. So what we're trying to do is to pass an array of strings to SQL and go and tell it to fetch a list of records that have these values in a specific column. And as we can see, unfortunately, that's not delegatable. So that's going to be a bit of an issue. So we've got a few workarounds. This is the first one where we're going to be doing a SQL query, and this is the best one as far as I'm aware, and definitely one that I can recommend. So thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe, like, comment, and it really helps us to get feedback on these videos to improve on them going forward. Thanks for watching. So let's first look at what the problem is, and what you see in front of you at the moment is a query to a SQL database, or a SQL table rather. It's got about 20,000 rows in it and just got some very basic information. So Donald as the name from 1 to 20,000, and title as duck to 1 to 20,000. When we now access this in PowerApps, we can go and have a look, and let's add a gallery to actually have a look at that data, and we'll see that there's no data source at the moment. Let's just connect it to the data source quickly. So there we go, and let's connect to the temp employees table. Right, so PowerApps does what it does best, and it picks up the data and builds the gallery for me. That's awesome. What we now want to show you is if I browse through this gallery, it's going to be able to, or it's going to fetch all of the information. So it takes a little bit of time, but essentially it'll slowly but surely browse through all of the information. So I can get access to all of the data in SQL regardless of how many rows in the table. So let's just go past 500 to just prove that I'm not lying, and that's 400, so almost there, and there is 500. Alright, so we've just passed 500 records, so we can assume that if we take a long enough time, we'll actually get to 20,000 records. But that's not the issue. The issue with the delegation is when you now want to run filter commands on this database, or on this table, you might run into some problems. So let's say we're going to filter that data source where the name is Donald, let's say 5. And if we save that, or not save it, if you just allow it to load, there we see Donald 5, and that's fine. So let's make that Donald 7 and allow that a second to just commit, and then here we go, there's 7, and we can do that all day. It'll work without any issues. We can also go and say find me Donald 12,003, and it's actually going to find that. So let's give it a sec to just realize I've typed that in. There we go. We'll see the marching ants at the top of the screen, and now it's got the correct record. So all of that is working very, very well. The big problem with this specific function that I want to show you is the moment that you want to compare the name to a list of names. So if we want to say that as soon as you find name, or rather return me all of the records that you can find in this list, you'll see that it's not going to find that. Let's just bring that down to our friendly 5 again, and it should find that. Just give it a second. There we go, we've got 5. And let's give it a second value as well. So let's say we're looking for 5 and 8. And let's see what that does. Okay, that's awesome. Now, if we get to 499, now it's getting closer to the problem. It finds that. It should find 500 as well. But now it shouldn't find 501. And it doesn't. And the reason why it's not working is it's got this little blue squiggly line over here, which telling you that there's a delegation warning and that the highlighted part of this formula might not work on large data sets. So this is it's not a massive data set, but it is more than 500 records at the moment, and that is a problem. And what this means is this formula, SQL or SharePoint or whatever data source that you might try to connect to, doesn't understand this formula specifically. So what PowerApps does, it actually translates this formula into a native function for the database or the storage for it to understand, and then run the query at the database side and then give you the data. Now, if it's a non-delegatable query like this one is, and well, this one is at the moment, I'm sure it'll be fixed in the future, but for now, an in operator isn't a delegatable query. Now, what's happening is PowerApps first has to retrieve all of the data from SQL and then apply this filter function in PowerApps. So it can't delegate this work to SQL. And the reason why I keep on mentioning 500 records is if you go to the app settings, under advanced settings, you'll see this infamous setting over here where you can specify whether PowerApps should return 500 records or 2000. So 2000 is the maximum, and then from there you're not going to get more data in PowerApps. So that's obviously not ideal, and that's what we're going to be doing now, is actually to delegate that workflow, or sorry, that work to Flow in order to go and fetch the data from SQL, because with Flow we can issue SQL queries directly as well as stored procedures. So this is what we're going to be doing now, and let's get cracking. First, let's go and create a new flow, and to do that we're going to use, just for now, we're going to use Flow as a trigger. We're going to change that to PowerApps later. It's just easier to be able to execute it directly from Flow, test it before we start throwing it commands from PowerApps. Alright, so let's go and call this SQL Query and go and create. Alright, so there's a blank flow, and I love this. There's just so many opportunities from here if you've got a blank flow like this. I mean, the world is your oyster. But for now, we're going to just dabble in SQL. So let's go and say, first of all, let's go and execute our query. So we can just go and prove the concept and make sure that this works. Right, so first we can go and execute the query. I've used V2 as well, and that seems to be working very well. So I'm sure for this testing we can just use that. And now we can go and select our server and our database. Here we go. If it's not showing you the correct database and server details, just make sure you've got the correct connection specified in the ellipsis over there. But essentially we're now going to say select star from temp employees. And if we save this, we should be able to run it as it is, and just make sure we get data from SQL before we get fancy with the rest. It's taking a little bit longer than it usually does, not sure why, but let's go and run that. Also at this stage, go and check that you've got the right connection selected. I know you've done that in the flow as well, but this has cost me hours before. We're trying to connect to a SQL server, it shouldn't be, and then you get all weird and wonderful errors. So let's go and run this and see what we get. Right, so the flows ran successfully and it took a second. It's quite impressive. I mean, that got 20,000 records, well it should, and if we go and click on that we can see that it actually did. So there's a massive amount of data that it got in a second. So yeah, kudos. This is connecting to Azure and SQL, so or SQL and Azure rather, so we can assume it to be quite fast. So next, let's include a little bit more information in the query, just to break it down a little bit more. So we can go and select star from that. If you don't need to select all of the columns, then don't. Then actually go and specify the columns that you are looking for. Because if you reduce the table width and reduce less columns, it'll be faster than if you include all of the columns unnecessarily. So let's actually go and do that, and just to be nice and thorough on that, so we're going to include that name and title. Right, so we include those from temp employees, and now we can go and say where we can now go and say what is it that we want to filter the data according to. And you need to plan this obviously, so you need to understand what's going to be your primary lookup and your primary key that you're going to be using for these lookups. So for now we're just going to say we're going to use name as an example. So we're going to say where name is in, let's give it a bracket, and now we can go and specify the names that we're looking for. So say we're hard coding this for now, and understand that's not ideal, but we're just going to test it. So let's say we're looking for Donald 1 and Donald 5, sorry, and Donald 10. Let's just run it like that for now. We can go and add more parameters to this in a second. So let's just go and run that and make sure we get data. It's always easier to start from the ground up and test it as you go along to make sure that you've got a solid foundation for the next step. Alright, so we got data and we're looking for 2 records, and there's Duck 5 or Donald 5 rather, and Donald 10. Alright, so that's working very well. So now we're ready to go and add some more goodies to this flow, but before we do, we just want to copy the result that we're going to give to PowerApps, and we're going to use it later on in the schema where we basically give PowerApps a heads up that it knows what data it's expecting, what it can expect. So we're just going to copy everything between those 2 square brackets, which in JSON terms this is an array, the square bracket, and then it's got a list of objects in it. And then these objects are records, so there we've got a curly bracket that defines the first object, and there we're closing the first object, and then the second one, which is separated by comma. So let's go and just copy that, and we're definitely going to use this just now. Now we can go and edit this flow, and then let's delete this trigger. This is something fairly new from PowerApps, where you can now delete triggers and change it. Previously you had to actually rebuild the flow if you change the trigger, so this is quite nice. Let's go and have a look and choose PowerApps, and we're going to say the trigger is PowerApps. So what happens is PowerApps is going to be able to call this flow from the PowerApps session. So that's important, and then from here we're going to also give PowerApps a response. So the default PowerApps will respond to PowerApps. Let me just go and look for it. Doesn't quite give you all of the options that we need. So if we go into here and we respond to PowerApps, you'll see that you can define text types or data types that you can reply with, but this is not exactly what we need because JSON isn't one of these yet. I'm sure it'll come, but it isn't at the moment. So what we do is we just use a normal HTTP response. So we go and say response, and here it is. So you will see that this is a premium connector. It's not particularly great news, but that's a discussion for another coffee. So in here we're going to tell it that the response we want to give to PowerApps is a status 200, which is telling it everything is cool, and we're going to give it a body of table results set table 1. And then in the advanced options we need to go and define the schema as well, and we're just going to paste the data we got in from the previous flow run, and that's going to automatically build the schema for us in a way that PowerApps will understand. Right, so just while it's doing that, go and remove these required fields over here. I have seen in the past that causes an error in PowerApps when you add the flow, where it gives you an error that it says the flow couldn't be added, or there's some function or something didn't work the way that it was supposed to. So I usually just go and remove that. It doesn't make sense to have it required on the response in this context. Alright, so this is now going to respond to PowerApps, but now we also need to ask PowerApps for certain information. So we want to get a list of the IDs that, or the data or the array that we want to search for in the query. So it's absolutely pointless to have it hard-coded over here, so we can go and ask PowerApps for that information. The easiest to do that is to go and add a variable. So let's go and search for variable, and we're going to initialize a variable, and we're going to call this var, let's say search array, and this is going to be a string because we're going to pass it a string from PowerApps. It's tempting to choose array at this stage. It doesn't work. I'm not sure if that's something that Microsoft is working on, but at the moment that this is not supported, or I haven't been able to get that to work at least. So if we go and choose string, and now we can allow PowerApps to pass this information through to Flow. So if we go and click on Ask PowerApps at this stage, it's going to give it a very ugly name in PowerApps, this parameter that it's going to ask for. So let's just, before we do, rename this. Ooh, that's not what I wanted to do. Not add a comment, I want to rename it. So let's say init var search array, and then we can go and say we're going to ask this in PowerApps. And now it's going to give it a meaningful name for the parameter and something that you can actually use. So next we need to go and format the string that we're going to get from PowerApps. So I know what string I'm going to pass to it, so I can go and specify the formatting now already. But typically that'll be part of your planning, is understanding exactly what that string is going to look like when you pass from PowerApps. So to do that, we're going to use the compose function, and that allows us to write some expressions in order to clean that up. So we're going to use the varSearchArray variable in there. No, I'm actually lying. We're not going to use it in there. We're going to write an expression to use it in there. Alright, so, and the expression is going to be two replace functions. So first we want to replace the double quotes, because PowerApps is going to pass this to Flow in double quotes in order to get it as text. And we need to change that to single quotes, because single quotes is what SQL understands. And then that's basically the first one, and the second one is then to also replace all of the commas that's separating these values with commas that are surrounded by single quotes. Alright, so we're going to be running two replaces in here. So we're going to run a replace on a replace, and then the variable, or what we're going to be replacing is the variable, and there you'll see you can select variables, and the variable name is var search array, like that. Let's just confirm that. var search array, yes, and of course I go and lose my expression, so sorry about that. Replace variable and var search array. And now we need to give it the first parameters to replace. So the first thing we're going to replace is a double quote. So we're going to give it two single quotes. So these are two single quotes, and I'm going to put a double quote inside of that to tell the expression that we're going to be replacing the double quote as the alt text. And then we're going to give it another parameter. So I'm going to now specify a comma outside of that, and now I'm going to give it the new text. And in order to do that, I'm going to give it 4 single quotes. Alright, so you might want to ask, but why 4? And essentially we need to escape those and to make sure that it adds them correctly. So you need to add 4 single quotes then at that stage. Alright, and then we're ready to close that bracket for the middle, or the second replace, or the inside replace. And now we need to do the replace on the outside. And now we're going to go and look for commas. So we're going to give it 2 single quotes, and inside of those 2 single quotes we're going to give it a comma, because that's what we're going to be looking for in the alt text, or replacing in the alt text. And now we're going to give it a comma to give it the next parameter, and in this case we're going to now give it 3 single quotes separated, or then a comma, and then 3 single quotes again, and then close the bracket for the outside replace. Alright, so I'll make this available for you in the YouTube video as well, in the description, so you don't need to try and read my commas and my single quotes over here. But essentially that should work. If you click on OK and there's no errors, it'll actually then write it into this, which it is doing well. If there were any problems with your formula or your expression, it would actually tell you that the expression isn't valid. Alright, so now that should be in a format that SQL can understand, and to test that we can now just go and update the SQL query with the relevant information. So what we want to do is just specify remove that, and then within the two single quotes, just want to make sure that we're in the single quotes, we're going to go to the output of the compose function. So there's the compose function, and the output of that is essentially what we're going to need at this stage. Alright, so that's working well. Let's go and save that. And before we now jump into PowerApps, let's just go make sure that this is giving us the data that we need. So let's go and perform the trigger. And it's now going to ask us for data, because it's now simulating what's going to happen in PowerApps. And it's going to ask us for the search array value. Alright, so we're going to be telling it that we're looking for Donald 1 as well as Donald, I don't know, 9. And we're not going to specify any double quotes, all of these sort of things in here. It knows that this is a text string, so I don't need to. If I go and run this, let's see if we get data. So the flow ran successfully, and that's usually a good sign. I say usually because it might not have received any data, and even if it doesn't get data, it's still going to run successfully. But in our case, it actually did get data. So there we go. We've got duck 1 at least. So it didn't get duck 9, Donald 9, because I made a spelling mistake in the run. Let's just go and run this again. So perform the test. I just want to make sure that it gets multiple values. So there's Donald 1 and Donald 9 seems to be bad luck. Let's just do 11. Alright, so let's make sure we get data this time for both of those. And if we expand this, we get Donald 1 and Donald 11. So that's working exactly as we hoped. And I think if it doesn't work at this stage, don't even move on to PowerApps, because then nothing you're going to do in PowerApps is going to make this work. So make sure that it works at this stage, and then we're ready to jump into PowerApps. Back into PowerApps, let's go and add another screen. Just go and add a blank screen, and let's add a button. That is still the easiest way to just go and add a flow, because from here you can go and say add an action, add flows, and then it's going to give you the list of all of the flows that's got PowerApps as a trigger. So for this, I think we said SQL Query, and this is where if you have required a required parameter in your, or required property in your flow, this is where you might get an error. But at this stage, this isn't an error. This actually means that it added it correctly. So from here, you'll see at the top it says that we're going to be running the flow, but in order to run this flow, we need to pass it some parameters. So let's from here just directly go and say we're going to pass this Donald, say 4, as well as Donald, let's make it 700 just to be funny, and just because we can. Alright, so this should give us 2 records, and you'll see that I've got one text string with the quotes around it, and that's up to you. You can build it any way you like in PowerApps. This is just the easiest for us to do. So let's go actually and test this. So we're going to write, if we now click on this button, it's going to write this, it's going to run this flow, but that flow is going to give us a response, and by just doing this, we're not doing anything with that response. So let's go and say we want to actually capture that response, and we're going to write this into a clear collect, and we're going to call temp local, and the value is going to be whatever it gets back from that flow. Right, so let's go and click on that button and give it a few seconds. Okay, so it got an answer, and if we go into view our collections, we'll see that we're getting Donald 4 and Donald 700, which is exactly what we asked for. So that seems to be working well. Just to be funny, let's go and search for 19,999, and let's see if we get data from there. And we do. You'll see it now speeds up. It's now very fast. It's now authenticated with Flow, and you'll see that literally takes less than a second to get that information, which is really fantastic. Alright, so from here we can now go and, same as we did previously, go and insert a gallery to just show that information. So just put it down here, and the data source that we're going to connect it to is temp local, and there's my 2 records. And right now we've got these the actual IDs or search array that we're passing to Flow hard-coded, so that's not ideal. Let's go and actually change that to something a little bit more dynamic so you can see how that will typically work. So let's move the query button to the right as well as the gallery, and on the left we're now going to initiate a data set that we're going to use as a source list of IDs to look for in SQL. So to do that, just go and say clear collect, and let's say that this is a temp expense list, and let's say we had a list of expenses which we're now looking for the details about the people who have expenses in this list. So let's go and add 1 record, and we're going to say expense ID is 1, and then employee name is Donald-1, and let's go and add another record. So there is 1. Let's go and say we're also looking for, we just need a comma to separate these 2 records, separate those 2, and so let's say expense ID 2 is Donald 9,555 for argument's sake. So that's going to give us 2. Let's go and add some more. We can actually add quite a few. It's amazing the performance. The moment I tell clients or people about this, they're immediately concerned about the performance, but it's absolutely staggering how fast this happens. So let's say we want 4 records, and it doesn't really matter whether you've got 100 or 1,000 records. Okay, obviously 1,000 will start impacting the browser because this is now downloading all of this information. But you can actually download a significant amount of data in this fashion, and it'll still be very, very responsive. Alright, so we've got 4 expenses that we're looking for, and we're going to now build a string, a concatenated string with the employee names in order to pass to Flow. So let's just go and run that to populate that collection, put in a gallery. Galleries are your friend, and just to make sure we see the data that we're working with. So that's our expense list, and there's our list of expenses, and just call this title is expense ID. Okay, so there's the names of the users that we're looking for, for the details. So if we go into query, all that we need to now do is concatenate that into a text or into a comma separated value. So to do that, we're going to take that out, and we're going to use the concat function, and the list that we want to concat is the temp expense list. Then the second parameter is the expression. So what is the field that we actually want to use? It's the employee name, and the separator that we want to use is a simple old comma. Alright, so then let's close the concat and format the text, and it's just a little bit easier to show you exactly what this is doing. So this is going to collect into the temp local collection the value that it gets back from this flow run, which is opened by this bracket and closed by this one, and then the parameter that we're passing to this flow run is everything that is returned by this function, which is essentially concatenating the employee column from that expense list, and we're using a comma as a as a separator. Alright, so it should now be as easy as clicking on that button to see if that works. And there we go. We've got Donald 1, 55, 958, and 10,055. So it's actually amazing how fast this is running. I can do this all day. Click this button, it's amazing. And let's go and have a look at flow to see what actually happens at runtime. So let's just refresh that and go into the flow run. And you'll see that all of this took under a second. And we can actually step through these actions. So if we have a look at the output from the call from PowerApps, you'll see that this is the string that we were passed. This was then put into that array, into the variable array. We then used composed to convert that into, you'll see that there's a difference. So there's no quotes around these. So there are quotes around this one over here. And then we use that in the SQL query, and then from there this is getting the data and responding it to PowerApps, or responding that data, or responding to PowerApps with that data. And all of this happens in under a second. So kudos Microsoft, this is unbelievably powerful. So guys, if you haven't subscribed yet, please go ahead. If you have any questions or suggestions, please hit the comment section. And yeah, hope to see you in the next video where we'll be doing a similar thing, but this time we're going to be using stored procedures. The method that we've done here doesn't work on on-premises SQL servers because the SQL query isn't supported through the data gateway yet. So we've also been able to do this using stored procedures. So we'll be doing this in the next video. So please be sure to join us, and thank you for watching and have a great day. Cheers. Bye bye.